Only in America.
Only in America.
Only in America.
Only in America.
Only America.
Only in America.
This time on Only in America, the courts ordered the Trump administration to reunite the thousands of migrant children with their parents. But the chaos continues.
This has been a barbarous process for the beginning. It has been a diabolical scheme, and the president playing chess, he's sort of been willing to sacrifice a few pawns, which are these children, in his effort to, look as tough as he wants to be.
And my conversation with an author and journalist about the dreamers who redefined what it means to be American.
Alex is working to be a lab technician. Marie would like to live and have her job and kids. Hareth is interested in politics. Felipe is working in Orlando, outreach for the city of Orlando. I think they just want to be able to actually live their lives and not have every day to fight for their very existence.
From the National Immigration Forum, I'm Ali Noorani with Only in America. No one is better qualified to write about the issues surrounding immigration in America than Laura Wides-Muñoz. Laura has reported throughout Central America and has written for the Miami Herald, the Washington Post, the LA Times, among many others. She has won the Associated Press Managing Editors Award and multiple awards from the Society of Professional Journalists. Before recently moving to Washington, D.C. with her family, she was in Miami serving as a vice president at Univision's English Language Fusion Network. Laura's first book is called The Making of a Dream: How a Group of Young Undocumented Immigrants Helped Change What It Means to Be American. The book is based on more than a decade of reporting on immigration, much of it done while Laura was a staff writer for the Associated Press. The book follows 5 dreamers who arrived in the U.S. as children and who've lived here for years without legal status. Growing up, they worked hard in school, planned for college, only to learn they were, in the eyes of the U.S. government and many citizens, quote, illegal aliens. A number of the youth Laura wrote about I have come to know over the years. They are tremendous leaders, incredible organizers, and generous souls. But through Laura's book, these 5 dreamers now are more than dreamers. They're human beings with real lives and real families. Kind of like the rest of us. Laura began our conversation by telling me when she first decided to be a journalist, way back in 2nd grade. Well, maybe not that way back.
I was sick one afternoon. I was home, and I looked on TV, and my cartoon was interrupted. The president had been shot. And in my 7-year-old diary, I write, the president was shot. He was not killed. Secretary Brady was hit. Terrible spelling.
You were in 2nd grade.
I was in 2nd grade. I knew even then how to do an AP lead. I knew it was the most important thing. Mm-hmm. I wanted to document this for history. I've always wanted to write. I've always been really curious, and this seemed like the best combination of those 2 traits.
Wow. What was I doing in 2nd grade? I'm not even going to answer that question.
But I will say that before I got there more seriously, I did a foray into thinking I wanted to be pre-med. Mm-hmm. I studied environmental studies. There was a period where I wanted to be a trapeze artist. My parents decided not to pay for a circus school. So it wasn't a straight shot, but that early, there was something always there that I was curious about the world and I wanted to document it.
So then tell me a little about your kind of early career in journalism. After 2nd grade,
Right.
Let's jump ahead to say early 20s or something.
Well, I worked on the high school newspaper, Go Augur Bit, and worked on the weekly paper in college, and then I had a Fulbright in Guatemala, and I was doing alternative energy development, but it was the end of the Guatemalan Civil War, and it was just there was news everywhere, and I wrote letters off to the Washington Post offering to be a freelancer for them, completely innocently, not realizing that they had plenty more people with much better credentials than I. And they all said thanks, but no thanks. But the Providence Journal Bulletin said, we really don't need anything in English, but we're just starting a Spanish language weekly section. Would you like to write something there? And I said, sure. And my Spanish at the time was not really good enough to write in Spanish, but I did my best and got some friends to help me edit it. And it turned out that this kid I'd met who was a guerrilla in Guatemala fighting against the government, had spent his high school years in Providence, Rhode Island. What are the chances of this? But this is true. And so they were very interested in that story, and that was really the first professional story that I did.
Really? Wow. Have you kept in touch with that kid?
No. I lived in Guatemala, and that's where I really got my start. And then I was a stringer for Reuters and AP in many places. And I knew him then, but I left Guatemala years ago. So I haven't.
So you cut your teeth as a journalist. Tell me, as you started doing reporting here in the States, what the immigration debate looked like from the vantage point of a journalist, who had done all this work in Central America.
Right, and I think that's where the interest came, because I saw the reasons people were leaving, the results, the trauma of the wars. And I started in Los Angeles, and I was covering education there and, looking at all these families who were trying to start over. And what was really interesting at the time was that this was the beginning of DHS. So it was the beginning of this concept of fugitive immigrants who, may have been convicted or of serious crimes like murder, but also just may not have shown up for their hearings, and trying to figure out who was a threat to the nation and who was scared of the government and was hiding. And it was really interesting watching the development, and this was, of course, right after, around the time of 9/11 and after. So I really got to see the span of the development of our current immigration policy and all the changes that started to take place right after 2000, as the 1996 big immigration bill really started to go into place. And so, it became harder to stay, therefore fewer people were leaving, and more people were bringing their families because they knew they couldn't go back and forth, and there was all sorts of changes, and that really started, and I was sort of fascinated about how it was affecting the community I was covering and then the nation.
What I like about the book is that it's wrapped around the stories of these young people and how they, I don't want to say they kind of found their political footing, because it's so much more than just politics for them. But take me through the process of kind of developing the idea of the book, but then really also saying, okay, these are the stories that I want to tell.
It's sort of serendipitous. I had a Neiman Fellowship for journalism, and I was taking a year off, and I was at Harvard, and a agent actually wrote to me and said, I see you're studying economics and immigration. Do you want to write a book on that? And I thought, oh God, that would kill me. That sounds so boring just to even think about it. No, I don't want to write that. But here's what I've been thinking about. And I had been watching these kids really since one of the main characters in the book, Felipe Sosa Rodriguez, had led this walk from Miami to Washington and really invigorated the immigration, particularly the immigration youth movement. And I'd always thought, someone should write a book on this, because this is a movement. This is going to be big, even though people weren't really talking about it. And I remember one time I was talking to my brother, and he said, well, you cover immigration, and, you're a journalist. Why don't you write that book? And so when she came to me and I was sort of thinking about this idea, that's really where it came to me. And then I knew, in the vein of some really great books, I'd always been really influenced by Hope in the Unseen, I think, by Ron Suskind, and later by Evicted, of merging really, really detailed journalism, but with really good stories. So you want to keep reading. So it's not like you're eating vegetables, but you're actually...
Right. You want to turn the page.
Yeah. I mean, we all want stories. I want stories.
Yeah.
And also, the other thing is, I would say that one of the things that bothered me at the time about the coverage of the so-called Dreamers was sort of always setting up this perfect immigrant kid. And, that's nice, but it really doesn't do these people justice. They're humans, they're flawed, they're funny, they make mistakes, and I think both for people who are interested in helping them, for them, and for those who want to come in their footsteps, seeing real characters that are flawed humans is much more interesting and much more inspiring than sort of these perfect, flat characters.
What are the things that they did right along the way, and what are the things that they maybe could have done differently?
Well, one thing I learned was the internal trauma so many of them had in terms of trying to put forward the arguments for the DREAM Act, but at the same time feeling that in doing so they were throwing their parents under the bus. And Marie Gonzalez, who's one of the characters in the book, one of the people who's from Jefferson, Missouri, she talked about this visceral nausea in her stomach as she stood up for the first time in Washington at the Capitol, speaking on behalf of Dreamers and saying, I came here through no fault of my own, and thinking, I'm so grateful that my parents brought me here. And by saying this, I'm basically saying that they did something terrible, but I wouldn't be here, and I wouldn't have all these friends and school and all of this if they hadn't done that, and feeling so guilty all the time. And I think a lot of people didn't understand how much that was. And so when young people were arguing for the DREAM Act instead of comprehensive immigration reform, I think a lot of, initially it was sort of taken as, well, they're sort of being selfish, they only want for themselves. But I think a lot of them were really, really torn up and saw this as literally the only path forward because the other bills were not making any headway. Mm-hmm. And I didn't really understand that until I started doing the research. And
it's funny, I remember when in Massachusetts, when we were working on the in-state tuition bill, we'd often, as advocates, say, well, these young people came because of no fault of their own. And it never feels right. Now with the family separation issue along the border, where we're blaming the parents for kind of just a perfectly natural act.
Right, and maybe there are consequences for the parents, but that's also true, but sort of what are those consequences and how do you deal with them? And then again, obviously acknowledging people have been here for 20 years and have been participating, contributing, we're benefiting from their labor. How do you factor in all of those issues? The other thing I think that I hadn't really thought about, again, is just what it takes to stay in a movement. Yeah. And for those who aren't doing this all the time, the mental toll of being on all the time. And whether it's immigrants or whether it's those who are, fighting on gun issues or Black Lives Matter or, really any issue, trying to find that balance so you can stay in the marathon and not get burnt out. And some of these kids, I think they would say their mistake was sort of being so focused that Hareth Andrade, who's one young woman who fights on behalf of her father, she ended up in the hospital because her body gave out, I think that's happening to a lot of people, and the fear and the uncertainty obviously is makes everything even worse.
When you and I ask for a raise or for a vacation day, you kind of feel like that little bit of a, should I ask for this? Right. These are young people who are asking policymakers, press, and the public for something that is so personal to them and their families. It's a courage that it's impossible to understand.
And another thing I think is that courage sometimes is foisted onto them. I think Dario, who's in my book, he wants to be a filmmaker. He doesn't actually want to be an activist, and he kind of ends up becoming a symbol and an activist. But some of these kids are just sort of leaders because they're doing their thing and they're having their life. And not everybody wants to do that. And some of these young people have gotten into this movement and become activists, but then sort of how do they translate that into other areas and other jobs? Mm-hmm. And also just some of these guys, they're just falling in love. They're funny.
Right.
There's just...
They're people.
They're people. They're life. Everybody, isn't on 100% of the time.
Right. The folks that you wrote about, as they have read it, how they reacted.
It's been great, and I was really, really happy that they felt that their stories were accurately portrayed. That was my goal, as well as sort of background on immigration reform and how do we get here. I let them read their sections with the caveat that I would not change anything that. Any fact or any act, I was not going to change things, but I wanted them to fact check because in certain cases they would catch things. Oh, I didn't live in this city at this time, whatever. It wasn't, this wasn't in third grade, it was in fourth grade. But I wanted no surprises. And so each of them read the section just related to them, and they made a lot of critiques. Most were caught and everything there were a few things that weren't, but I felt really good about that. It was hard for some of them to read it. It was very hard. But Hareth told me she actually learned things about her own family, and actually all of them did, really? Because the parents would tell me things that they hadn't even shared with their kids. And Hareth talked to me about her learning about what her dad was thinking when he was detained, and that he really hadn't talked to her about that. And so it actually increased the conversation in their own families and made her have a better appreciation for what he went through.
Mm-hmm. So in the process, you ended up being almost a receptacle for the family's stories, things that they couldn't tell each other, maybe.
In some cases, yes.
Yeah. Were you expecting that?
I don't think I thought about it. I do think that's what journalists often do, because we're sort of a safe place to talk, but that wasn't my goal. I was just trying to get a 360 view and talk to as many people, and obviously I did the interviews, but I also got court records and documents, and then many of these kids, their stories had actually been publicly documented, or they had documented them, so there were videos. In Dario's case, his dad was just filmed the family.
Oh, really?
And meant to send those home movies back to Mexico to his family to tell them that everything was okay, but he never did. He just kept them. And so Dario actually ended up making a film about his mother who died of cancer. And and he incorporated many of the home movies, and he shared many of them with me. So when I'm talking about what the father says back in 2003, I'm not making this up.
Right.
This is from
It's on the video.
Yes, exactly.
I think I remember reading that. I was like, wow, that's some impressive research
How did
there.
you get that? Because it's and it's actually in his movie. It's a great first movie that he made as his college thesis.
How are they kind of experiencing the current environment around immigration, kind of based on their experience? I mean, they've spent most of their lives as leaders in this movement, and kind of this is where we are. Yes,
I think it is very tough for a lot of them, and not just the main characters, but many of the other leaders who sort of play lesser roles. I talked to all of them. I think their current reaction really reflects some of where they are in life. I know from Marie, who's now a U.S. citizen with 2 kids of her own, and she's working, and she lives in New Mexico, and it's really hard for her to see and hear all this because it brings up all this old trauma. And even though she's a citizen now, she still sees Border Patrol, and she gets tense and scared. But that's different than for Harith, who has DACA, but is worried it may go away, and what that will mean both for her and her ability to support her family and her younger sisters. And then that's still different than Alex, who's seeking asylum right now and is very worried that, with everything that's happening, his case, just simply may be thrown out. Mm-hmm. So each of them are coming in with a different perspective.
So what do you think the sequel of the book says?
Wow.
Yeah.
It's funny. A bunch of people have said you're going to have to write a sequel. What happens to these guys and what happens in America? I would definitely want to wait a few years, I think, to have something to say. But, I hope that in America we're able to take some action and not just continue in this paralysis when it comes to our broken immigration system. And, obviously I'd care about these kids, and I hope that their situations are resolved as they can be. But more broadly, you see the numbers. 80% of Americans want something like that. High 70s, 80s want to see the DREAM Act, want to see some form of legalization for these kids with a path to citizenship. Most Americans want, they don't want to see kids separated. They have all these things that we want, and so there's been this cultural shift, and I'd like to see the politics catch up with the cultural shift.
But I guess my question really is, what does a sequel look like for these characters?
I mean, I think, in each case it's going to be different. I think, Dario would love to be a filmmaker in Hollywood. And right now he can be hired, but if DACA goes away, it'll be tough for him to get a job. Alex is working to be a lab technician, and he's going to college for the first time. He just wants to do health and HIV prevention and help young men at risk. Marie would like to live and have her job and kids. I think, Harith is interested in politics. Felipe is working in Orlando, outreach for the city of Orlando. Mm-hmm. So each one of them has their own space and the things that they're doing, and I think they just want to be able to actually live their lives and not have every day to fight for their very existence.
Just want to live their lives. It seems something that, pretty much everybody else takes for granted.
Right, I know it's pretty cliche to say that, but it's actually true. Yeah. I mean, I can't imagine what it's like. Marie used to talk about this. She had, before DACA, it was, as you know, kid by kid who would get deferred action, person by person, and Senator Dick Durbin helped her, and it was only a year's reprieve, and so at the end of the year, she would quit her job. She would break up with her boyfriend, and she would pack her bags and wait to be, told to leave. And then the last minute, ICE would say, okay, you can stay, and it will give you another year. Well, she would have lost her work permit. She lost her driver's license. She had to get her work permit again. She couldn't get to work till she had her driver's license, and then she couldn't go back to school till she had her work permit so she could pay for this, so your whole life. And then it would be 6 months in, and she'd have to start over. And I can't imagine that much uncertainty all the time.
It's like every 6 months you have to reboot.
Yeah, your entire life. Yeah. And sort of with an expectation of, having some stability. Obviously, there's people in this world who live in uncertainty all the time, but these are kids who have grown up with some level of expectation that they're going to be able to contribute to this country and be part of it.
In the stories that as you're learning about them and telling them, who were the kind of the secondary characters that surprised you most?
One group that I really found interesting were some of the foundations. And this isn't really the Dreamers, but they really saw early on the need to seed nonprofits that could then help smaller nonprofits and really help develop these grassroots leaders. These kids didn't spring out of Zeus's head like Athena. They learned to become leaders. They learned organizing, and it was really that effort to get the money to lots of different groups, which I think really helped. I don't do foundation work. I don't think about this. I don't think most people do, about how do you
build a movement?
How do you build a movement? How do you develop civic engagement, especially in a group that's so marginalized and so afraid even to show up in a group anywhere?
Yeah. Name of the podcast is Only in America. My last request of you is to finish this sentence. Only in America. ...
Only in America are we really grappling even with how to welcome and bring in so many immigrants. I mean, that's what makes our country special. It sounds so cliche, but it's true. My family, came in on the boat. Only in America are we really grappling with what to do with so many immigrants and how to welcome them.
Thank you so much, Laura. Laura Wides-Muñoz is the author of The Making of a Dream, How a Group of Young Undocumented Immigrants Helped Change What It Means to Be American. There's more about Laura's life and work at immigrationforum.org, where you can also subscribe to Only in America on all of your favorite podcast platforms.
Support for the National Immigration Forum comes from the James Irvine Foundation, expanding opportunity for the people of California, and from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, established in 1911 by Andrew Carnegie to promote the advancement and diffusion of knowledge and understanding.
This is Only in America. I'm Ali Noorani. While Capitol Hill remains consumed with the nomination of the next Supreme Court justice, the tragedy along the border continues. And many local television stations had their own horror stories of divided migrant families. Here's Democrat Congresswoman Lois Frankel on WPTV in South Florida.
I just say it's shocking that we have a government that takes children from their parents and that doesn't know how to bring them back together.
Despite the court order telling the Trump administration to reunite parents with their children, it seems unlikely it will be completed soon. On Tuesday morning, White House spokesman Raj Shah attempted to explain why.
One thing that we're running up against is that we need to vet and ensure that the people claiming to be parents are actually parents. We've had examples in the last administration. There was an Inspector General report in which children were given to people who came with them across the border illegally who were not their parents. These children were abused. These children were taken advantage of. That's not a situation we can repeat.
But Washington Governor Jay Inslee, speaking on CNN, wouldn't accept any excuses for the delay.
And this is par for the course. Look, this has been a barbarous process for the beginning. It has been a diabolical scheme, and the president playing chess, he's sort of been willing to sacrifice a few pawns, which are these children, in his effort to, I guess, look as tough as he wants to be. But we are grossly dissatisfied with the government's response. They have given us nothing but inaccurate information. They've gone so far last week to suggest that they would consider just placing these children with foster parents as a reunification plan and call it good, which is totally dissatisfactory.
Elsewhere, there were multiple stories of toddlers appearing before judges, parents being deported not knowing where their children are being held, and immigration enforcement actions across the country. There was also news of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services working to revoke people's citizenship. Take the story of Miami resident Norma Borgoño. According to the Miami Herald, the 63-year-old secretary who immigrated from Peru in 1989 volunteers weekly at church, raised 2 children on a $500 a week salary, and suffers from a rare kidney disorder. But a week after her baby granddaughter came home from the hospital, Norma received a letter from the U.S. government. The Department of Justice was suing to denaturalize her as part of an unprecedented push by the Trump administration to revoke citizenship from people who committed criminal offenses before they became citizens. So here's the backstory. In 2012, Norma helped the FBI make a case that put her former boss behind bars for 4 years. Norma played a small, inconsequential role in the crime, but she took a plea deal, was sentenced to 1 year of house arrest, 4 years of probation, paid $5,000 of restitution, and was relieved of her sentence early. Now, the administration wants to revoke her citizenship and send her back to Peru. As the Migration Policy Institute's Mus Chisti put it, in terms of the aggressive nature towards denaturalization, it is a very different day. And to make matters worse, immigrants who are serving in the U.S. military are being discharged and could also face deportation, sometimes back to countries such as China or Pakistan, where their American service may classify them as traitors. All of which provoked the ACLU to intensify their campaign to galvanize the public.
The court just ruled that Trump must reunite every family he broke apart. Time is ticking. These children must see their parents again, and they're counting on us to act quickly.
But, on the bright side, Rehan Salam points out from a new Washington Post SCAR School poll, the number of Americans who want immigration levels increased now surpasses the number who want to see them decreased. Therefore, Rehan writes, support for rebalancing immigration is far more widespread than support for reductions. So the question is, how long can the administration continue to go against the wishes of the majority of the American people? I'm Ali Nirani. And that's it for this week. Only in America comes from the staff of the National Immigration Forum. The producers are Regina Medina and Emily Chow. The executive producer is Kathleen Farrell. See you next week.